For over 20 years, Growth Climate is continuing to set the standard in personal and professional development. In this program, the president and founder will present Growth Climate's foundation course, The Anatomy of Human Interaction. By examining core belief and value systems, Growth Climate has clearly identified the fundamental principles that permit people to make deep and lasting interpersonal connections. Growth Climate's Kenneth H. Patey has been a professional educator since 1963. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Sociology, Child Development, and Family Relations, and a Master's degree in Professional Counseling. Ken was nominated for the Innovative Programming Award in the first annual In Honor of Excellence Awards program sponsored by the National Association of Continuing Education. Ken and his wife Sharon are the parents of 5 daughters and 6 sons. He has lived in Canada, England, the United States, and the Middle East. Together with his family, he has traveled extensively in other countries as well. This exposure to people from many nations has provided a wealth of intercultural experience and has deepened his profound understanding of human interaction. This is Growth Climate's Kenneth Patey presenting The Anatomy of Human Interaction.
I had the privilege a few years back of spending a week with about 60 exceptional American Indian youth leadership program. At the end of the week, we spent some time with one of this group, and as we finished eating, she said to me, "Can I tell you a joke?" And I said, "Please do." This was a 6'3", 17-year-old Lakota Sioux girl. And she started the joke. She said a white man was walking along a road one day and saw an Indian with his ear to the ground. And he said, "You don't mean to tell me that you Indians can tell things with the ear to the ground now, do you?" And without moving, the old Indian said, "2 wagons. First wagon pulled by 6 horses, driver old man, sitting beside him small boy. Second wagon pulled by 2 oxen, driver middle-aged man, both wagons carrying grain." And the astounded white man said, "You can tell all of that just with the ear to the ground?" And the old Indian said, "No, wagons run over me 10 minutes ago." Things are not always as they appear, are they? Nowhere is this more true than in the field of human relations. Let me tell you something about the birth of Growth Climate. It actually had its beginnings in the fall of 1974. At the time, I was working full-time as a tour guide in the Middle East, and I was with a group of some 50 tourists sitting on lush Persian carpets in a Bedouin tent on the northern edge of the Negev in southern Israel. We were being hosted by an Arab sheikh and his family. On those kinds of occasions, I usually sat back just absolutely enjoying the way the tour group was being fascinated by the unique differences between the culture of this Bedouin society and their own. On this particular day, there was something unusually different for me. I found myself, instead of being amused by my tourists' reactions, I found myself being absolutely intrigued and fascinated at what I was seeing as some very, very unique similarities. As I watched this noble old gentleman, I said to myself, what is it about this man that reminds me so much of an executive I knew in London, England? I thought next of the owner of a large factory in Wichita, Kansas, and I thought there's something about him that I see in this Arab sheikh as well. And then I thought of another man in Salt Lake City, one in Portland, Oregon, one in Canada. And I began from that moment for the next 3 years an observation project, looking to see what it was that had appeared so mysteriously almost to me in that setting, where I found myself seeing a man in a totally different culture, a different kind of country, not the same kind of dress. I doubt that this particular man had ever been out of the Negev. They hadn't gone to the same schools. They certainly weren't from the same ethnic or religious background. Their cultures were different. And yet somehow in all of that differentness was a sameness that intrigued me. What I came to realize was, after that day and many other days and months of observation, that the significant similarity was in the belief and the value system of the individuals. And that when you look at a person's belief and value system, if they are the same, you will sense a similarity, not necessarily in how they look or how they walk, but in the feeling that comes from those individuals. I've began to see also another very, very interesting phenomenon. And that is that if you could watch a person's behavior long enough over time, you could write down the belief and value system of that individual almost without error. On the flip side of that, if you were to tell me what a person's belief and value system is, I could predict almost without error the conduct or behavior of that individual in any setting. That is really how linked those two are. Our beliefs and our behavior are flawlessly tied together. The observation process, though it began in '74, has never really quit. I've been at that observation process full time since then. The end result of that, actually with its birth in 1981, was growth climate. The end result at this point, after over 25 years of that observation, is the course that you now attend, The Anatomy of Human Interaction. The value of this course will be seen in many ways. What you will see is that in the interaction pattern of individuals, and that interaction pattern or style will be based on the belief and value system of those involved, will have an impact on those with whom they interface. It has a very powerful effect. When we can come to understand the impact of our own belief and value system, perhaps then we can make some very powerful changes in the way in which we deal with other people. We have in our group here tonight people from many different walks of life. We have parents, and of course some are home-type parents, that's where they spend their time. There are those who work at home and work also in the business arena. We have people in the helping profession. We have people in law enforcement. We have people who are businessmen. And in each of those settings, if we were to take the material on human interaction, the anatomy of human interaction, you will come to understand what will impact where you are, whether it's on the home front, whether it's in a school as a school teacher, whether it's in a caregiver setting working with troubled youth. All of those settings will find value in understanding the anatomy of human interaction. I'd like to begin with a metaphor, a three-part analogy, if you will, and pull together a couple of concepts. If you were to go home tonight, for example, and find a member of your family with a fever of 102 degrees, and you decided you wanted to do something about that fever, short of calling a doctor, what remedies might you try? What would you do? A cool bath, perhaps? What else? Aspirin? Something else?
Loosen the clothing.
These and many other dozens of remedies, and it depends where you are in the country, have as its target to drop the fever. Now, once in a while, we give one dose of one of those things, the temperature drops and stays dropped. All it was a glitch in the system. In fact, the human body's defense mechanism at the invasion of some foreign organism is to bring about a rise in temperature of 2 or 3 degrees, and it kills it. So if it drops and stays dropped, not a problem. However, more often than not, 2 to 4 hours later, we get that rise in temperature. So we apply another dosage. 2 to 4 hours later, we get it to go up again, and we begin to get a yo-yo effect with that fever. What is it telling us about the fever? What is the fever? It is a symptom. And somewhere beneath this symptom, oftentimes masked by other symptoms, will be the root cause. If we can determine the root cause of that fever and the other symptoms, and let's say that in this case it would be a bacterial organism, if we could get the right kind of medication to that root cause, this fever will tend to drop and stay dropped. Part one. A number of years ago in one of our weekly news magazines, there was a feature article on stress. The whole front cover was on stress. One of the questions that I would ask of you is this: what are some single word descriptors of what it's like inside an individual who is in stress?
Chaos.
Chaos. What else? Single word descriptors. What does it feel like?
Tension.
Tension. 3 or 4 more.
Racing heart.
Another one.
Impatient.
Impatient. You're probably wondering what this other list is. Confusion. Fear, frustration. What else?
Pressure.
Pressure. Hopelessness. Now let me ask another question. How do we tend to act when we're uptight, tense, nervous, frustrated, feeling anxious? Angry? How else? Defensive. More.
Withdrawn.
Let me say this. Sometimes with the word withdrawn, some people may withdraw, and at the other end, they become openly aggressive and assertive, and they're in your face. Okay? What else? Depressed. You come home from work, and you walk in the house, and your wife said, "Did you get the bread?" "Will you get off my back?" Now, is that a result of the question? Not really. But something in him is provoking that instantaneous kind of response. If you take words like defensiveness and anger and impatience and short-fused, all of those kinds of words, we could place at the top of this column a term, misbehavior. And let me state that misbehavior is an outgrowth of or manifestation of stress, and that is true at any age. Have you noticed, for example, even with little tiny children, a child that is trying to stack blocks, and in their frustration with the stack falling over and over, what do? They finally knock over the whole thing in their own frustration. So regardless of the age, when these kinds of feelings set in, we tend to misbehave. Not that racing heart is misbehavior, that's a physical response to stress. Not that pain is misbehavior, it's again a physiological response to stress. Depression isn't misbehavior, though you may have some individuals, if they're in a family where depression shows up in pity party or sadness or being sullen, what would an insensitive person say? "Oh, will you knock off the pity party?" And so what is a normal response of somebody beginning to close off becomes mistreated as a misbehavior. And so when a person is feeling this and gets that kind of a negative response, the close down process is even greater. Does that make sense? Let me define misbehavior. Misbehavior is any action or behavior pattern that is outside somebody's acceptable standard or limits or parameters. What might be acceptable, for example, in one school may not be acceptable in another. What might be acceptable in one community may be totally frowned on in another. What might be acceptable in your home may not be acceptable in somebody else's. Give me, if you would, a half a dozen things we would call misbehavior from any setting: home, school, community.
Screaming.
Screaming. This is another one of these words where at one end you could have somebody who screams, and at the other end somebody who goes totally silent, won't talk. Another one.
Hitting.
To hit, some kind of physical violence. What else? What's a common one in little kids who are frustrated?
Breaking things.
Adults do that too. Sometimes they break other human beings, not very smart. Crying. What often, particularly in little children, goes with crying? Tantrums. If I were to ask you the question, how do you stop a tantrum, what would you say?
Ignore it.
We could ignore it, but what if the tantrum is in place to get attention? The second you ignore it, it will accelerate. What else?
Let them talk why they are having that kind of feelings.
Let them talk. What if their talking is abusive and angry and they're shouting and their language becomes foul?
Well, listening to what they say, not how they say.
Oh, listening to what they say and not how. Okay? What else might you do?
Set rules. If you want to talk to me, this is the way that you want to talk to me.
Well, if I have to listen to your rules, I'm not talking. And it is a choice. You know, my question really isn't to give a list of how to solve it any more than this list teaches us how to solve that. You see, tantrums and misbehavior like fever are almost always the symptom of something else. And yet most of our effort is spent pounding on symptoms. The most exciting tantrum, if you can ever call a tantrum exciting, was by a 40-year-old mother of 8 on an empty cul-de-sac in Linden, Utah. They had called from out of state, asked my wife and me to work with them. They were struggling. We decided that we would separate. I would work with the husband, she would work with the wife. And my wife chose this empty cul-de-sac, a subdivision that had started with great gusto, curb, gutter, sidewalk, pavement, everything in place, but no real estate sales. And so there it sat for a few years empty. And so the husband and I went together, came back about an hour and a half later to that empty cul-de-sac, and sitting outside our van in the middle of this cul-de-sac was a quilt, a very thick quilt comforter, and my wife and his wife were sitting there together. We kind of shared notes. I said, this is kind of where it's been for us in this last hour. My wife said, here's where it's been for us. Would you like to take over? And so I thought, all right, I will see if I can affix responsibility. It'd be very easy, for example, to say, what does he do that bothers you? And if he was, you could give me this big list. Or if I said, what does she do that bugs you? You could give me your list. In affixing responsibility, you do it differently. So I said to the husband, what do you do that bugs your wife? See, that affixes the responsibility right where it belongs. He has the monkey. And bless his heart, he gave me 10 things. I do this, I do this, I do this, and I do that, and I do this. And the last one he said, and I actually do this one on purpose. And she said, I knew it. And so I said, all right, thank you very much. Would you tell me what you do that bugs him? And she said, well, he does this and this and this, and he does that. And this one he says he does on purpose. And I said, I know, he already told me that. What do you do that bugs him? And he does this, this, and this. And then she added 2 or 3 more. We're up to 12 or 13 things that he was doing that bugged her. I already knew most of that. So then I said, it's very interesting. And I directed my question to her. When I asked your husband what he did that bugged you, what did he do? Well, he listed all those and he admitted them. And I said, that's right. And I said, and when I asked you what it is you did to bug him, what did you do? And she was, who needs you? Who do you think you are anyway? Why? And then she let off the most powerful tirade of blue words. She'd have made any truck driver proud with the kind of language that came out of her mouth. She turned the air kind of a smoky gray at the base of Timpanogos. I kid just a little, but not much. And in that process of all of this cussing, she flipped over on that quilt and she was kicking her feet just like any one of my little kids had done and smashing her fist into the quilt, still swearing at me and her husband, until her hand went off the edge of the quilt onto the asphalt. And as she bloodied her knuckles, the crying quit, the tantrum quit, and she said, please help us. Now, see, the way you stop a tantrum is to bloody their knuckles on the asphalt. That isn't what we're talking about, is it? But you see, no matter what we could have tried to do in this circumstance, unless we could get to the root cause behind the tantrum, behind the family crisis, we could not have made progress. The thing that's fascinating to me about human behavior is that almost invariably, the root cause of misbehavior is belief linked. In fact, the fascinating thing about the human mind is that once we have beliefs in place in this computer of ours, this computer or brain is engineered to keep us acting totally consistent with those beliefs. Let me illustrate with a couple of examples. 6:45 one morning, my oldest son walked up into our bedroom. He should have been ready for school. He was not. He walked in his pajamas and he said, and I quote, "Dad, I don't feel very good today." I said, "What seems to be the trouble, Kenneth?" "My stomach hurts." I said, "What kind of a hurt is it?" "Well, I feel like I'm going to throw up, Dad." I said, "Is it affecting your voice?" And he said, "No." Why would he change his voice when he talked to me about his not feeling well? He would change it because if he didn't sound sick, perhaps I might not believe that he was sick. I shared this story at a noon luncheon. I was a guest speaker at a women's business luncheon. And as I shared the story, a lady raised her hand. She said, I had this experience just Monday. She said, I called in sick, talked to my supervisor, told her I wasn't well, wouldn't be into work. Tuesday, I got back at my desk, and she said about 10:30, she walked by, and she said, well, you didn't sound very sick on the phone yesterday. Now, what is the supervisor training her staff to do? That when you call in, you pretend you're sick. I'm not feeling very well today, Louise. But you better answer the phone that way, the same way every time they answer the phone that day. Let me give another example. Have you ever tried to pay a compliment to somebody who struggles with his or her worth? What do they do with the compliment? They play it down. They turn it back. For example, if I were to say to you, Adriana, and let's say that you had been up and given an extemporaneous presentation, no advance warning, and you did very, very well, but you don't believe you do well. If I paid you the compliment, what might you say back to me?
It was nothing, or I don't think so.
It was nothing, I don't think so. You see, we tend to take the genuine compliment and we turn it. Let me show you what happens with this graphic illustration. Suppose that this card represents a genuine compliment. If my compliment is genuine about her performance, my compliment ought to invalidate her perception of her performance. But if she has a belief in place that she doesn't do well, and the red acetate represents her belief system, it becomes a filter, causing her only to see what matches her perception of herself, the validation that she did poorly. What's my challenge as one who paid the compliment? What's my challenge as a parent if a child discounts a genuine compliment? What's my challenge as a teacher if a child is always putting self down? My challenge is to interrupt this filter. So if in the face of a negative response, I would come back to this young lady and I would say, Adriana, let me tell you something about me. I never say things I don't mean. That really was a fine presentation. Can you accept that from me?
That's different, because now if I say something, I'm putting you down.
That's very astute. Did you feel what I said?
Yeah, but I would feel like, well, nah. I would
Yeah,
like
teachers are supposed to say that.
Yeah, I'm
Parents
like-
are supposed to be complimentary. You see, the challenge is that even though I may interrupt this for a moment, they will slam the door back on the circumstance because of what they have come to believe about self. A little later, we're going to come back and talk about how to interrupt these filters in a way that will cause that individual to hear and sense and feel. They still will slam it shut, but we'll talk about that. If our beliefs are that potent, and they are, that they cause us to filter out things that are genuine and to see only things that are in error, false evidence for their own beliefs, then we ought to do something about looking at the impact, this whole impact of beliefs. We are the byproduct of the beliefs we acquire. I am who I am because of what I believe. Individuals who struggle with their worth or their self-esteem, and we choose, by the way, to use the word self-worth rather than self-esteem, suggesting that people come to beliefs about their value or their worth. If we have beliefs about self that are in error, which cause us to see a diminished view of who we really are, we need to make some changes. Parents can make a difference on a home front. Teachers can make a difference in school. Businessmen can make changes in corporate culture that affirm the worth of employees, and they'll find some pretty powerful things taking place in terms of productivity and growth and a lessened amount of employee absenteeism. Those who work with troubled youth and the caregivers of our society, and many of you fit that mold, working with those whose hearts are closed down, whose minds are shut off to learning, can have the capacity to touch those lives and turn them around and give them the capacity to stand tall and bright and self-affirmed and feeling good about self.
Section 1, Communication, an expanded viewpoint.
We've been asked a number of times why we didn't call the course a course in communication, because those who take it typically end up with quite a skill in communicating, excellence in communication, if you will. If you take a look at typical courses on communication, however, if we were to call it communication, we place a mindset in those who are thinking about the course, and their answer is, well, I've already had a course on communication. So we didn't want to do that. Let's take a look at communication from its standard patterns. Communication typically is said to have two parts. The verbal portion, mine and yours, and the nonverbal portion, which is primarily emotion, mine and yours. For years, the difference between the verbal and the nonverbal had been quantified as being 30% verbal and 70% nonverbal. A major university in the United States did research on this, and they said, we've really been in error as we've analyzed it over a large research project. It is actually 10 and 90. I noted with interest that 6 months after that, a national advertising agency set forth the statistics that said it's actually even worse than that. It is 7% verbal and 93% nonverbal. I don't care if it's only 30-70. When you're looking at this disparaging difference, where do we spend most of our prep time when we want to communicate with somebody?
Verbal.
On what we're going to say. We want to get the right words, the right intonation to our voice. We want to make sure that we have things like right kind of eye contact so that we can communicate clearly what it is we want to say. We get our logic trains all in place. We line up our ducks, if you will, so that the verbal message we send gets across the way we want it done. The problem comes, though, in what goes on beneath it. Let's say, for example, in a family setting, if I were to say to my wife, tuna casserole again tonight, the underneath message is, can't she cook anything else? Is she going to hear that? Well, I thought you liked tuna. Good grief, can't please him no matter what I do. Well, it pleases me, but this is the third day in a row and I'm getting it for breakfast. Gosh, this woman's got no creativity at all. Well, you want me to be frugal. Every time I have leftovers, he scolds me. This message is taking higher priority than the verbal, isn't it? Now let me add another component. And that is, my beliefs fan my emotions on the things I verbalize. Your beliefs fan your emotions on the subjects you verbalize. If you really want to change the communication process, where do you need to work? We need to work on the beliefs. That is the power source in our communication. If we really want to impact, we've got to deal with that portion. If you'll turn in section 1 to page 3. The climate which surrounds or is emitted by an individual has a tremendous impact on what it is we hear. If the person is domineering or controlling, can you sense that and feel it in his voice? If the person is arrogant or full of pride, will you sense that? It was very interesting. 2 nights ago, we had a small gathering at a friend's home, and a guest came unannounced. He walked in, a large young man, and somebody said, well, how's the engagement? He said, well, actually it terminated. You see, the girl and I were having a bit of difficulty on how leadership in the home ought to be. And I thought to myself, good for her, that she had exited the system, because what was coming off him was this arrogance, this superior insight of knowledge. You see, that is an emotional output from him. Even the way he walked, as he talked about this, said to me that he was literally dripping with a belief and value system that placed him in a power position in what would have been, I suspect, an abusive marriage. Now you think, my gosh, that's an awful large conclusion to reach. Those emotions are betrayers. All of you know individuals who run that arrogant emotion when they talk. We have individuals who are afraid to make a decision. Can you spot them? Can you spot individuals whose emotion is one of possessiveness and ownership? Individuals who are struggling with their worth, or individuals who are shy and withdrawn. You see, all of those are nonverbal indicators of where they are. On page 3 is a very thought-provoking poem. It says, "What you meant, I thought I heard in words, but careful observation shows your words in print could have meaning different from what I caught from you. Oh, I only said," and you rephrase the spurious line, "but oh, my friend, it's not the end. Feelings leave indelible markings in the mind." See, it's that nonverbal portion that goes with it. But our beliefs literally are the power source behind our communication. The question then comes, what happens when people have two different belief and value systems? Let me illustrate by talking about my background and the background of my sweet spouse. I am a Patey on my father's side. I am a Henderson on my mother's side. My wife is a Harker on her father's side and a Jensen on her mother's side. So far, we don't look very much alike. In fact, somebody said once, if you married an identical twin, you still have enough problems to drive each other straight up the wall. Let's take a look at some interesting portions of this background. My father was born in England and immigrated to Canada with his family when he was 8 years old. My mother's parents were born in the state of Maine, immigrated to Canada via Provo, Utah in 1902. The Harkers came out of Redmond, Utah, and immigrated into Canada where Sharon's father was born. The Jensens came from Denmark via Utah and then into Canada where Sharon's mother was born. So we're all Canadians. Does that make us the same? Not too likely, is it, Jürgen? All right, let's take a look at backgrounds. In terms of education, education was unimportant to my father. It was unimportant to my mother. It was very important to both my wife's parents. Let's take religion. Religion was unimportant to my father, very important to my mother. It was important to both of them. Occupation. My father was a sign painter. My mother was the daughter of a farmer. Sharon's father was a farmer by occupation. Sharon's mother was the daughter of a wealthy merchant and landowner. Let's take another one, kind of one where the rubber meets the road a little bit. Money. In my family, there was one checkbook, one checking account, one signature, and it was my father's. In Sharon's family, there was 2 checking accounts, 2 checkbooks, 2 separate signatures, and never the twain shall meet. 2 very, very different families. Now let me ask you this question relative to differences. If you were Sharon's parents and along came Ken Patey as a suitor, what would be your concerns? Would you have any? What might you think? First concern, what would it be?
Occupation.
Occupation. That could be a fairly serious one. This is sort of a hand-to-mouth kind of occupation in a very literal sense. But, you know, my father had done fairly well, so that might have been a problem. It literally was a problem. The day we were married, my wife was signing the marriage documents, and she began to cry. Her aunt, who was standing behind us, said, "Oh, isn't it tender? Sharon's crying at her own wedding." Now, the assumption was that it was tears of joy and happiness and how exciting. In reality, Sharon said to me years later, "I was crying when I saw you write sign painter as your occupation, because I thought, have I given up in the marriage to this man, though I love him, have I given up the possibility of education for our children?" You see, that was a concern. It had never come up prior to that. What other concern might there be?
Religion.
Religion. Oh my. That could be a serious one. My 3 older brothers had decided they didn't want any interest in religion. There were only 3 of us of 8 who had any interest in religion. Could that have been a problem?
Yes.
I'll say it could have been. What else?
Money, power.
Money and power. You know, this one is listed very frequently as the most common reason for what? Divorce. You know, I really don't believe that. I really believe it is the final catalyst. It is the final excuse that is used. It's the one that tips the scale, if you will. All right, I've had enough. And off they go. But it was the end result, or the end piece, to another mounting puzzle of problems. And that was sort of the last straw. What about education? That could have been a real big one. You see, and in my family, my father only went to the 8th grade. Is that typical for somebody born in 1904? Really is. But my oldest brother quit 9th grade. My second brother quit in the 10th grade. My third brother quit. I decided at the end of my 11th grade I wasn't going back to 12th grade at all. I literally lay in bed, the morning school sort of started, and when the bell rang, I was watching the clock, and when that large hand hit the top and the small hand hit the 9, which was a wonderful time for school, I said to myself, all my buddies have to go to school and I get to stay home and work. That didn't sound too good. So I kind of course corrected, and by 9:25 I was at school, walked into the door to the office and said I'd like to go back to school. The principal walked out and said, very inappropriately, "What are you doing back at school? I thought you were going to dig ditches for the rest of your life." Now you see, that was not a very affirming thing, but that kind of did something to me, and I thought, I'll do what I choose to do. I was kind of a resistant kid, and I went back. I played, though. I really didn't work. It was kind of a social thing for me. In fact, when I graduated from high school, if I had had 2 percentage points less, I would not have graduated. Just barely made it. There wouldn't have been a university in the world who would have accepted me as a student. However, at age 25, I kind of got a spark inside me that said, I really want to do something about education. I was working with youth, and I was encouraging them to get a college education, and here I was, barely a high school graduate. And I decided to listen to my own sermon, and off I went to college. The university said, well, sometimes with people who are older, who come back to school, but whose grade points were very, very low, maybe it was a matter of motivation and not smarts. And so they gave me a 1-semester trial on academic probation to see how I would do. I was grateful for that. And a 3.7 at the end of that first semester took me off the probation line, and I graduated 5 years later, having chosen to do it in 5 instead of 4, having purchased and finished a home, 2 new cars, 5 children, worked 52 hours a week, and went to school full time. Was it a matter of intelligence? No. It was a matter of a value system that had shifted to where education became something that was important, something that we could then tie our children to. Sharon was very grateful for that kind of a shift. Well, we have a lot of differences. There is a page in this section if you wanted to kind of compare. Now, those of you who are